So you graduate from college then in what year?
61.
61, okay. And then I'm assuming you started job hunting.
I tell you,
And-
I took my final test, and I had worked off and on during winter breaks and stuff like that for the DNR. I did some tabulating of various statistical things and whatnot, so they kind of knew who I was. And I applied for the job, and as soon as I took my last test, I was off to the North Shore, and I worked up on the North Shore on steelhead trout.
Oh,
And I'd worked on steelhead trout as soon as I could get there, and they had weirs set up in two of the creeks up there. There's about 20 different little rivers and creeks that run into Lake Superior that the steelhead trout run up. And we had weirs set up in the Cadence River and in the Split Rock River. And I would go, after the first week, they transferred me to Grand Marais. And every day I'd start in the morning, I'd go and check the weirs, and if there was trout in there, I'd anesthetize them, and I'd weigh them and measure them and tag them, put them back in the water, and away they'd go.
okay.
And then I'd go up and down the rest of the stream and do a creel census with everybody I could find to see if they were catching any fish.
Okay.
And that went on until about the 15th of June, which is when the commercial fishing opened up here.
Right.
And that was about the time the steelhead quit running anyway, so it worked out good. So.
Okay. So then, tell us about how you ended up in Warroad then.
Well, as you say, at about the middle of June, there was a lot of commercial fishing going on in Lake of the Woods back in those days with the mink ranching and whatnot. And two different groups of mink ranchers and fishermen decided to try a commercial fishing trawler. They called them otter trawls. They call them otter trawls because I suppose otters are good fishermen.
Okay.
So they're called otter trawls. And John Pick and Happy Flo had one, and George Heinen and Julius Anderson had the other one. And how they got them up here on rail, that was back when the Burlington Northern went through town. And they got them on rail, and how they got them off the rail and into the water, I'd like to have seen that, because that must have been a pretty interesting operation. Yeah. But anyways,
weren't the Linders owners, weren't they
Linders,
involved?
And I don't know if they were silent orders, but they always ended up every day coming and getting their share of the fish.
Okay.
So somehow or other they were involved.
Okay.
Because they couldn't sell the fish that they caught they couldn't sell the rough fish.
Yeah.
They could sell the game fish, the
Okay.
food fish.
Do you know any of the background about how, I'm guessing there must have been a lot of permits and wrangling with the state and DNR to
yeah.
put trawlers on the lake.
Yeah, you had to be a commercial fisherman to start with. So you had to relinquish your commercial fishing license in order to get a trawler.
So of those owners of the boats, were they all commercial fishermen?
Yeah,
Did they all have license?
Happy Flo and John Pick were gill netters, and George Heinen had a set of pond nets that stretched from about Springfield to the Swift Ditch.
Okay.
And when I got here, he didn't have his pond nets in because he was getting ready for the trawler. But he was at that time, and Julius, I think, he was sort of a silent Parker. He had a mink ranch, but I don't think Julius ever was a commercial fisherman.
Okay.
But George Heinen was.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and
Tell us.
Then that went on. I'm sure they had a lot of talking and whatnot.
Yeah, I would guess.
Yeah.
Tell us about the trawler itself.
Well,
What kind of its size, how big it was, what kind of a crew was on there? And
there was two different trawlers, the Jackie, which was owned by John Pick and Happy Flo, and the JLC Jean, which was owned by George Heinen and Julius Anderson. And they were slightly different. The Jackie was about a 40-footer. They were all steel hull, of course. And they had two different ways to deploy the nets. John, the Jackie, had what they called otter boards, which are kind of like underwater planing boards. They were hooked off center, and they were big cables going down through a series of pulleys and whatnot. And they release them in with winches and pulleys, and they release them. The Jackie had a 671 Jimmy Diesel in it. Made a lot of noise and made a lot of smoke. But otherwise, and it was hard. You couldn't go and sit in the cab because it was so damn noisy in there about drove you nuts. So you had to sit outside in the run.
Yeah.
And when it was rough, you get splashed on once in a while.
Okay.
But it was Jackie was a real good boat. It was about it weighed 22 ton.
Wow.
And yeah, it was a deep V and about 40 foot long.
Okay.
The JLC Jean was about a 45 footer, but that had a Ford gas engine in it, and that was more of a flat bottom boat, and that wasn't near the boat that the Jackie was, as far as I was concerned. When you laid in the trough, it'd want to get real tippy. And it was sort of flat bottomed, but it was good going into the wind or with the wind. But when you laid it in the trough on a windy day, it would get pretty tippy. So.
Okay.
And that had a big winch on it that pulled the whole trawl up on the deck, and then they'd get the fish out of the trawl that way. And then the trawl itself is. Had a lead line and a float line. They had a 40-foot headline and a 40-foot float line, and then about side lines about maybe 5-6 feet, and they were 60 feet long. And the back 10 feet of it had what was called the cod end, and the cod end had differences. The front part of it had small mesh, so the fish couldn't get through, but the cod end had larger mesh, so it let the small fish go through, just like a gill net. Like the gill net had like 4-inch stretch mesh and let the small fish through, and this had like 3-inch stretch mesh. But with the pressure of the water going through it, it pushed all the little fish through and kept the big fish in.
Yeah.
And in order to get them out, the Jackie we'd let the outer boards, they're called outer boards, you'd let them down on a series of winches and a big 1/2-inch cable and going up through a whole bunch of pulleys and whatnot. And you could tell when it hit the bottom, go clunk, and you'd hear you could see the gold cable, and then he'd stop them, he'd lift them up a little bit, and then the trawl was set. We'd fish mostly when there was mud. You couldn't fish where there was rocks.
Right.
We fished, north of Archie's Reef a lot, between Archie's Reef and Gull Rock, and
Rocky Point area, in other words.
Rocky Point area, and away from the reefs, basically.
Okay.
We never fished in close.
I want to go back to the boat a minute. Do you have any idea where those boats came from? They were brought
come
in?
off of Lake Michigan.
Okay.
And I think one of them, at least, I think maybe they both went back to Lake Michigan.
Okay.
But they come off the lake, and how they got them on a train and how they got them off the train, and it's got a bit of mystery. They must have an awful big
Crane. Yep.
in order to lift them things up. So.
Okay. Let's talk about your role on what was your purpose?
Well, first of all, they wanted to know what they were catching. Back in those days, the commercial fishermen, the gill netters, basically tried to catch walleyes because walleyes were selling for 25 cents a pound and tullabies were selling for 3 cents a pound. And you don't have to be a real big mathematician to know that 25 cents a pound is a lot easier than 3 cents a pound to make $1 a day. So most of them would set their nets at least with some intent to try to catch walleyes or saugers. And mostly walleyes, saugers were too small, they'd go through the net, but they'd catch mostly walleyes. So, and that was, back in those days, the lake was managed as a commercial fishery, not as a sport fishery. It was managed as a commercial fishery, the Minnesota side at least, because commercial fishing was a big deal. And not only that, the mink ranches in the area all needed that rough fish for food for the mink. So it was managed as a commercial fishery.
Okay.
And that went on until the mink industry folded.
I assume when you would come in with a catch,
well, when my
mink
job,
ranchers would come collect
my job was to keep track of what they caught. And we put them in fish boxes, and a fish box was approximately 100 pounds of fish. So every time we'd get fish and we'd load them into fish boxes, I'd write down We had 6 boxes of Tulies and a third of a box of this, and at the end of the day, I'd tabulate that, and then at the end of the week, I'd make a total of everything we caught for the week, and I'd send a report down to the state. And we did that for the first year, and then we did it the second summer.
So they only operated 2 years on the lake?
Well,
Is that what you're saying?
no, they operated after that. They become licensed then. They were no longer an experiment. They become licensed because they caught about 90% rough fish. They caught burbot, which was really a prized fish for the mink ranchers because of the oil, the cod. They're a member of the cod family.
Yes.
And they have cod liver oil type thing, and they did mink shine.
Yep.
And so tulies were the main source of food, but burbot was a extra sideline. And we were the only ones. Gillnetters very seldom caught a burbot because their noses didn't fit in the hole.
Right.
But we caught quite a few burbot in the trawler, and there was between the tulies and the burbot, and occasional sucker. We'd get some few suckers, and that was all rough fish. And that was all probably about 90% of their catch, as opposed to 60% of the catch on commercial on gill nets and upon nets. So the state says, well, that's what we want to do. We want to preserve the game fish as much as we can, and still have food for the mink.
So, what if? Because I'm sure they caught walleye, saugers as well.
Yeah. We didn't get very many saugers again because they'd go through the mesh, but we'd get walleye. And no kidding, if we could find the school of tulies and how they didn't have any electronics in those days, and these guys were just knowledgeable guys, fishermen. They knew the lake. John Pick was, and George Bushy, Henry Bushy's dad, ran the JLC Gene.
Oh.
And they were all old-time commercial fishermen that knew what the fish were doing at certain times of the year and where to go and where to catch them. And we'd go through a school, and if we'd get right in the middle of the school, we'd have 99% tulies. There would be nothing but tulies. But if you'd get the edge of it, then you'd have tulies, and then you'd get large walleyes. You'd get great big ones.
Any idea, like a big catch, on a day's catch on the lake, how many pounds of fish would they bring in?
We'd get 50 boxes, 5,000 pounds.
Okay.
That would be a real good day, and a real good lift would be 10, 12 boxes of fish.
Okay. Yeah.
And then we'd start at 8 in the morning, and we'd fish till 6 in the afternoon.
Mm-hmm. Can go back to the crew a little bit. Like, how many guys worked on the trawler at that time?
On the JLC Gene, it was George Bushy was the guy that ran the boat. It was Henry's father. He was the boat driver. And Jake Hepner was the guy that shoveled the fish in the boxes. And then Julius Anderson and George Heinen had to ride along because the owners had to go on the boat. And they mostly sat there and drank beer. That's what they did.
Yeah.
And that was that. And the Jackie was John Pick and Happy Flo. And John Pick was the pilot. And then Happy and John would come back when we would do the lifts. And then I'd shovel myself too.
And help.
So I was always shoveling tulies.
So I assume you worked both boats. You alternated?
Every other day.
Oh, okay.
And we'd work every day.
Okay. All right.
The mink had to eat every day, so we fished every day.
Okay. So you worked on the boats then for 2 years.
Yeah, well, actually a full year. The first year I stayed right till November.
Okay.
And you could the pay on the DNR wasn't great, and you wouldn't pay overtime. You only work for 40 hours. They'd pay you for 40 hours, and then after 40 hours, you got what was called calm time, which is time that you could take off but not get paid for.
Yeah.
And so you could take over. It's sort of like if you work for 2 weeks, then you could take a week off, and you'd actually get paid for it, but you wouldn't get paid overtime. You just paid straight time. So by the end of the first year, I got to be good friends with a guy by the name of Buck Sargent, who used to work down at the fishery. And I used to go down there, and he taught me how to fillet walleyes and how to take the Y bones out of a northern pike and
Yeah.
all that kind of good stuff. And I got to be good buddies with him. And I hunted deer with him the first couple of years. And we actually hunted out south. And he actually took me out to the Red Lake Indian Reservation a few times. And we weren't supposed to do that, but I'd hold the light. And we weren't supposed to do that, but don't tell anybody.
Would you call the trawler experiment on the lake, was it a successful?
Oh, absolutely. As far as doing what it was intended to do, it was, and there was, as far as I could tell, there was no damage to the lake bottom. You'd think with this big trawl it'd be, but we were always out in the mud, and you could never see any kind of mud or anything like that. And we never caught anything, never caught any things in the bottom, we just mud. As far as I know, there was very little environmental damage, and the catch was, like I say, about 90% rough fish.
Okay.
And that was, but they actually worked very good. And
Okay.
they caught enough fish, they couldn't sell any of the fish except the food fish. They had to use all the rough fish themselves, but Heinen's were the second largest mink rancher in the world. They had like 20,000 mink. And John and Happy both had about 10,000 mink between the two of them. And Julius had a small mink ranch, but they used them all up. And they freeze them because all winter long,
Right.
they had no source of food, so they had to freeze them and feed the mink in the winter.
Yeah. How about, you've been here for, what, 60 years or thereabouts?
Well, I first came here in 1961,
Okay.
and I went to 1/4 of graduate school. Then, because in the wintertime, the DNR said, well, you might as well go back to school because we don't have a whole lot for you to do until spring again.
Okay.
So I went back to school for 1/4.
Okay.
And then in the spring again, I started in 62. I came up here, and I've been here steady since 1962.
Okay. So in your time here, you have, without a doubt, seen a lot of changes on the lake and,
for sure,
what has happened here.
Well,
how do you view those changes?
Yeah, the lake itself has been changed. Of course, there's no commercial fishing, so now it's managed as a sport fishery. And we used to go, I used to run a launch for Kells, and I had a Chris Craft, a 25-foot Chris Craft. And back in the old days, we'd go out after work in June when the fish were really biting good, and we could I used to go to Manitoba, and we'd fish Popple Point or Gould's Point or the North Point or George's Rock or someplace up there, and we could catch our 8 walleyes, and then you could come back to the south side and fish the South Point and catch 6 more walleyes. So we used to catch 14 walleyes, and I used to, Maury Taylor and Ev Taylor used to go quite often with us. So we'd have 4 in a boat, so we'd have 4 times 16 to come in and clean when we got back. So we used to have a freezer full of fish, and we froze them in milk cartons in water, and they stayed good for a long, long time. We'd fill them with fish in water and put them in the freezer, and they'd stay good. We ate them. I ate a lot of fish.
That's why you're so healthy today.
Maybe.
You ate all that fish.
I'm glad they didn't have mercury in there. Otherwise, you'd be able to tell the temperature by watching how. But the lake has changed some in the commercial, in the sport fishery. And I think the biggest change is in the wintertime, with all the winter fishing that goes on and the wheelhouses that are coming up. And when we drove to Bemidji yesterday, we must have met 15 wheelhouses coming.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's more pressure right now in the winter than there is in the summer, as far as the walleye fishery is concerned. There's lots and lots of that. And of course, the equipment has changed as far as boats.
Yep.
Back in the old days, a 50 horse was a big deal, and now they got 400 horses.
Yeah.
And so there's a
It's crazy.
little bit more equipment